That call from the Cowessess First Nation for the Pope to apologize was echoed again today by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and there is support for those calls from the Catholic bishops in Saskatchewan. Don Bolen is the Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Regina. Archbishop Bolen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I know you've been to the Cowessess site a few times. I'm wondering how you're reflecting on this chapter of Canadian history and the role that the Church has played in it.
It's a tremendously painful time as we see much more clearly than we ever have the pain and suffering and damage, the brutal legacy of residential schools. Chief Cadmus in his remarks yesterday said, "The truth is there," pointing to the cemetery. So it's a difficult time, but Cowessess and the chief have been very clear that we need to confront the past in order to take the necessary steps to move towards apologies, amends, the pursuit of justice together, and reconciliation. So it's a path we have to walk.
What are you prepared to do on that path? You've issued an apology to the community, but how can you help move towards those goals that you've just laid out?
Our relationship with Cowessess is a very good relationship, but it's really governed or shaped by the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action addressed to the churches, where a number of Cowessess members are part of our Archdiocesan Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, and addressing a number of areas, work in parishes and schools, information, and the pursuit of justice, specifically pertaining to cemeteries. It's meant supporting in whatever way we can, including financial support for the work that they wish to do in the cemetery, making files available to the extent that we had files that were helpful. Right now, we're working in search for old photographs that might tell us a little more about the location of the cemetery. Just accompanying, letting them take the lead, and assisting wherever asked.
On the question of files, are there documents that the diocese has in its possession? I know the Oblates were primarily responsible for this, and I know Father Ken Thorson has committed to release what they can to help with this. Is there anything that your branch of the church has that you can release to them to help?
Well, we released what we had a year and a half ago. Of course, because the Oblates ran the school most recently, they have any school records. We have sacramental records that had information about death records, right? So that was passed on. I guess we've got a little bit of information that the Oblates would have more of who was actually serving here at the time. Because it was not run by the diocese, there isn't much, but we want to help, and we want to create the liaisons or assist and facilitate in the communication with religious communities in any way that we can.
What about facilitating communications with Pope Francis? I mean, we heard from Cowessess First Nation Chief Cadmus Delorme, that he wants Pope Francis to apologize for the role of the Catholic Church in residential schools. I know you've been trying to facilitate such an apology. I mean, what do you think the chances are that Pope Francis will come to Canada and apologize for this?
Well, I think the next vital step is this delegation, which is going to be going to Rome to meet with Pope Francis before the end of the year. A delegation made up of First Nations and Métis and Inuit leaders, survivors, knowledge keepers, elders, youth, where they can speak directly to Pope Francis, where he can hear them, hear their experience, their suffering, their request, and directly engage with that.
I wonder, though, Archbishop, why such an expedition to the Vatican is even necessary, given the body of evidence that we have and the information that we have. The Pope should know by now. I mean, is this merely a formality to trigger the invitation for him to come here, or does the papal apology hinge on the outcome of this meeting?
I'm not sure to what extent I can answer that question, right? But I mean, I know that the heart of Pope Francis is wanting to engage, wants to accompany people who are such suffering and struggling, and especially those who have been wounded by the church. When he went to Bolivia, he extended apology to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He spoke strongly about the legacy of colonization and how wounding that's been. So I trust he'll speak out of that and desire to respond out of that. That's about as much as I know and I can say.
Is it your view, though, that Pope Francis should come to Canada and offer the apology as recommended in Truth and Reconciliation?
I would profoundly welcome that.
We spoke with Bobby Cameron on the show last night, the chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. And he said if the papal apology does not happen, he will renounce his Catholic faith. What do you say to Chief Cameron?
I support his push for Pope Francis to come to Canada. I will do everything I can to accompany that process and that request. Perseverance, right? And don't lose your trust in the Creator.
Would you understand why Mr. Cameron, why Chief Cameron could be driven to this point, given the events of the last century in Canada and given the situation right now and even the struggle to get to the point where at this point, we still don't know if an apology is even forthcoming?
I understand well the pain of Indigenous people and the negative reactions towards the Church. I've heard the stories of survivors, the experience of people who didn't survive, the various kinds of abuse that were a part of the residential school system and the legacy, the way that the Church is complicit in that. And I hear that pain and I feel it. And so it's not for me to judge how a person carries that and tries to move forward, but I profoundly respect. I respect the whole TRC process, which didn't write churches off, but called us to engagement, called us to action, and gave us ways to engage and to act so that we could be agents of ultimately of reconciliation. You got to get from truth to reconciliation through apology, through amends, through the pursuit of justice together, right? But the TRC calls us to that, and I think that provides us a roadmap. Chief Cameron is calling us to task in that regard, and I respect him for that.
The events that happened here, obviously, it predates your time in that area, and Chief Cadmus Delorme spoke well of his relationship with you as the Archbishop yesterday when he was speaking to the country about the discovery, and spoke of the relationship between the Church and the First Nation right now. And I just wonder, as a final point, in the immediate term, what steps can you take to help the community deal with the trauma that the announcement and the confirmation of the 751 sites has released this week?
Well, we have a relationship with a number of members of CBC, and to support them and accompany them and walk with them, to support any request that comes from Chief Cadmus or the community, any request for help of whatever nature. But the whole colonial model was that the Church and the society, the Western society, knew what needed to be done and did it, right? Mm-hmm. Now we've tried to reverse that. I've heard from Indigenous leaders and learned, well, nothing about us without us. So we look for them to take the lead and to tell us where they need help. One of the areas we've heard strongly from a member of CBC is that when they do education about the experience of residential schools, it always re-triggers and traumatizes, and that we've got to take up the task of telling that story of Indigenous history, of the experience of Indigenous peoples in this land, and the pain and the suffering that colonization, the Indian Act, residential schools brought, that we need to take on telling that story. So we're working also in the field of education to do that.
Okay. Archbishop, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.